I am particularly thrilled to be here tonight with Charlie. Charlie has been my friend and traveling companion and mentor in many ways over the last almost 20 years, which is hard to believe. And he's been an inspiration to me, and I think you'll see why tonight. Let's get started. I'm going to do something a little self-indulgent to start off, which is to show a few of my pictures, which is, this is from my collection of Get Your Ass Out of the Car and Go Make That Picture book, upcoming book, which is one of the things that Charlie has inspired me most by, is his energy and determination to get out and photograph. And the story behind this picture was, I think we're in Kansas City. Is that right with this one? Do you know?
I think so.
Anyway, we were in a little...
Doesn't matter where.
We were in a little square, and we were parked, and it was raining. And I looked out and I said, oh, look at that guy. It looks like he's looking into the distance. It's so funny. And I was just like, and he said, well, go make the picture. Get out of the car. What are you doing? And so I did, you know, I did. I'm going to make myself look not so good in a few of these things. This is another one of those pictures. Charlie and I were working on Civil War projects at the same time and did a lot of miles through the South and the West. And this was after a long day of shooting. We were driving through the Battle of Elkhorn Tavern, Pea Ridge, a battlefield in Arkansas, and which is very near Bentonville, which is the home of Walmart, and it's a very odd and interesting town in the middle of Arkansas. So you have to drive through the battlefield to get to where we were going. And again, I was like, oh, look at the sunset, it's so beautiful. Get out, go make that picture. So 2 minutes later, I'm sprinting through this field, and you know, the lights going, and you know, this was the only good picture I got on that trip. So thank you, Charlie. And then this is the last one. These are some, you know, sort of details from some pictures that I took. We were driving through Tennessee. And end of the day, I'm tired and moaning and groaning. And
you did all the driving.
That's true, I did do the driving. And we drove by what looked like a bingo, Friday night bingo parlor. And I said, again, he said, oh, well, let's go check it out. And I said, well, I'm kind of tired. He said, no, let's go. And then as we were going in, I said, well, do we talk to someone? He said, just start taking pictures, you know. If they kick us out, at least you'll get a few. So anyway, all this to say is that here I have many pictures of Charlie shooting, and here are just a few of them, just to show you the kind of determination and energy that Charlie brings to his work. So let's move on to Charlie's work. And this is, I asked Charlie to pick out a few photographs that were particularly important to him, and this was one of the first. So Charlie, why don't you tell us about this picture?
It's curious that you just showed a panorama yourself of a horizon line. I have to talk about this picture because my father was born in Central Illinois. I went to the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. My mother went there, my father went there, my brother went there, so on and so forth. And I kind of hated it, flat. But when I was a kid, we had to drive up to visit a grandmother in Lincoln, Illinois. Doug Boss is here, has been there with me, which is a small town in Central Illinois. And as we went up, drove, I was 10, 11 years old, we'd get to the Illinois border, and my father says, oh, we're in the land of Lincoln. And I go, okay. And he said, isn't it beautiful? And I said, what's to see? There's nothing there. You know, it's just flat corn, you know. And I'd say growing up in Kentucky, we were also from Kentucky, and Kentucky's beautiful, rolling fields and green grass and so on and so on. He said, son, you don't see it. I said, what don't I see? The horizon. It's all in the horizon. Skip forward a few years. I'm a senior at the University of Illinois. I was an English major. I'm going into the Peace Corps. I think my father had died, left me a camera. I decided I should take a course. I was a journalism minor, but something told me go to the art department. I trundled over to the Krannert Art Museum, where the art department was partially in the basement. Certainly photography was in the basement. It was always in the basement. In some ways it still is, but it's come up, particularly in the digital age. We don't have to go into those dark rooms. And as I'm going down the steps, above the steps, transit, is this picture laid out quite big. I don't know how he blew it up, but I said, oh my God, that's what my father was talking about. It's about seeing, and turned out that the teacher with Art Sinzenbach. So sort of the rest of my career is history based upon that discovery of how to look, how to see something other than what you expect to see. And this was the first serious picture I ever made at University of Illinois last semester, senior year. A little house on the prairie. And it's kind of stayed with me all these years. Somehow I got the technique right. It's a 4x5. It's formal, but it has a little bit of the Sinzenbach in it. It has something about intimacy about it. I caught something, though the horizon's in the middle, isn't it? That's curious. A little bit of both. Like the way the steps come forward, so on and so forth. But I recognized that I'd made a picture. I'd made something that the camera saw rather than something I was musing on. I went into the Peace Corps. I was in a horrible accident and had to return to Louisville, Kentucky, my home. I jumped into a graduate program in humanities in October. I was very lucky to avoid the draft. And there I met several important photographers, actually. Most important, Ralph Eugene Meatyard. And that's me in the famous series, Lucy Bell Crater, the family album, before people were doing family albums. And Meatyard photographed his wife with one mask and all of his friends and family in another. And Meatyard taught me something about the Gothic. Of course, that previous picture has a little bit of the Gothic in it, which I already guessed was in me, but also about how to look also, because he was an optometrist, and he talked about how things like how white objects came forward and black objects receded, and how space worked in the square, and all those kind of things. Lucy Bell Crater is not typically Meatyard, though it might be his most famous book. And he talked about the optics of how the camera sees, and that affected me a great deal. And he gave me my first show in his optometry shop in Lexington, Kentucky, and that was quite wonderful. And he was a very generous guy. He died at 45. He also did some wonderful landscape pictures called The Unforeseen Wilderness, which has become very celebrated in recent years, not at the time. So let's go forward. Yep. This is a picture I took about that time. Sort of had the kind of surreal sort of conflict in it between Asian landscape, a wallpaper, and clearly a European landscape in it, painting. And I always thought it had humor in it. I always thought it had a conflict in it and tension in it that also Meatyard talked about, the irony in a picture, the yin and the yang, and the juxtaposition of things, which is what makes the picture dynamic. So that's an important picture to me. So
you were in this program that Meatyard was teaching in, and then Lyndon Johnson changed the laws, right? You weren't able to get out of the draft with a graduate school.
I got drafted, pulled out of this, what was a humanities program, but they let you take anything you want. And I got out of the draft. I didn't get out of the draft. Got out of the Army 2 weeks from going to Vietnam with a rifle in my hand because I had spastic colitis and I had an incident on a battlefield, on a mock battlefield. I was back on the block, as they said, on a perfect fluke. And I knew about Aaron Siskin. I knew about the Institute of Design. Doug Boss here was a student there at the same time I was. We met when I got there. But I knew that that was one of the few places one could go study photography at a serious level as a graduate school. It was started by Maholy Naj, and Mies van der Rohe was there. He had died the year we came. So I meet Siskin.
Yeah, so I've always been interested in that relationship because he was a mentor to you, and then I was a little bit surprised when you said that he hadn't had a big impact on your photography style, which I thought was interesting, and I know you learned a lot from him. I mean, your son is named after him. Is Aaron here?
No, he's not.
But anyway, I'm curious what kinds of things you learned from Aaron as a photographer, as a teacher, as a human being. You know, what were some of the...
Well, we could spend all night talking about that. But he was, what we call a mensch. He was a dirty old man, a nice mensch. He was compassionate. He was sophisticated and cultured in many ways, and human and down to earth in other ways. But the spirit of both of what he represented, and Callahan, who we didn't really study with, but who had recently left, but his mark was there, was this is a wonderful way to engage the world. Be a photographer, and you don't have to, you can take it seriously. It can take it as an art form, though Siskin in particular and Callahan both were very happy to call themselves photographers. They never called themselves artists that I remember. And that's important to me, actually. I am an artist, but I am a photographer first. Aaron encouraged you to photograph, and he actually didn't ever want anybody to work like he worked. He talked about space, he talked about composition, he talked about tensions, he had an idea that a good picture is a balance. This is a perfect example of continuing tensions. And of course it's negative and positive, and you don't know the scale, and the photograph is the photograph, it's not the real thing, it's an image, it's a piece of art. It's a transformation of something, it's a still life.
Let's take a look at some of your pictures.
All right. So this was part of my thesis. It was a large body of work I did on landscape. You can see some relationship to the negative, positive of that previous Siskin picture, I guess. This was in England. This was in Kentucky. I call that Kentucky K. I was very interested in the negative and positive space, doing away with the horizon line and the sort of just simple, I guess, abstraction of nature itself, and the briars and the thickets and stones and all the things that one finds in nature, but could be transformed into something different, and very much influenced, I think, by Chinese landscape scroll painting, because I had a sister-in-law who did that. So, and that was my first real body of work, I guess. I mean, we all experimented with all kinds of other things. There are many other projects. But this continued for a few years into the early 70s. And it was 4x5. And we went on a lot of little road trips to look at landscape. We both did it in different ways. We graduate. We've been partners for a long time from the Institute of Design, and we're teaching at Columbia College a year or two, I guess, Columbia College in Chicago. And we take the winter road trip down the Mississippi, down to the Gulf of Mexico, and we discover Cajun, Louisiana. Two guys on a road trip right after Easy Rider. I remember we were a little scared when we went up on the what do you call it? dike. And we spent 6 months there photographing Cajun culture. And we think, and many others might agree, we did probably the definitive document, at least of that period. And that was a show that went up during COVID. We never got to see it at the Historic New Orleans Museum. It took all those years before it really got properly seen. And there is a book called The Cajun Document. So that's the first major long-term road trip, I guess, that I took. He drove. I'm trying to talk a little bit about histories and photography. Somewhere in there, I got back to Chicago and I started using the 2 1/4 single lens Rolleiflex called an SL66. I had it all along, actually. And I made the next picture go to the beach. A whole body of work called Beach on Chicago Beach. It was a book published by Horizon Press. Go back to the previous picture, if you will. That's a picture by Lisette Modell. She was a major photographer, a humanist. Some people said street photographer, but she did other things as well, portraiture. I hate that term, street photography. And she was Diane Arbus's teacher and many others, and she had studied with the same teacher whose name I forgot that actually Cartier-Bresson studied with. She was Austrian, Jewish immigrant, and she had the first real program at the New School. And I always admired her work, and I'm always kind of shocked at how she's not been more celebrated because she was really important. Let's go forward. I roamed around the beach in Chicago where it struck me that the horizon's at the top of that. This was a place where people just unabashedly displayed themselves without any inhibitions, and particularly in the 70s. And I thought it was a place both of humor, but pathos as well, and of kind of human relaxation where everything came out, all the physical and emotional kinds of things. I did a lot of pictures. This is a pretty big project, which we're only showing 2, of course. And I got very much more interested in confronting people, and I think somewhat in the same way Lisette Modell did, and other photographers that I came to admire. By confronting, I mean getting intimate with them through the camera. And I never really took pictures. Most of the time everybody knew it was there. I didn't sneak pictures. But the Chicago Beach, how many know Chicago? You do. But you know, it's right there. It's right, you know, it's unlike any other city except maybe Rio, where the beach is really right there. New York waterfront was never developed the way Chicago waterfront is, though it's gotten better. And you know, you could go from your office and go lay out half naked on the beach, and for lunch you go back to your office, put your suit on or your dress on, and you know, put on the mask. But you're unmasked on the beach. So that was the first project of that broke with my landscape picture making. And because the Cajun document was both of these things, but you know, it was really about that social landscape. Go ahead. I'm just showing 2 more Lisette Modells. I did, at the same time, I was working on people on the street and parties, of which these are 2 pictures from that same mid-70s period. That was going to be a book, but it never got done. And I always love the humor starts to break out. These guys, twins with all the same dress and the pens in their pocket. And this guy was some kind of mogul in Chicago, I think one of the board members of the Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art. I was very interested in gesture and the way people dressed and how they looked and presented themselves, which I'll get into a little bit more as we go forward.
How are you getting access to these parties?
You know, it was curious. It was a time when, you know, people had parties, and I don't know if they still do, but they dressed up, there were events. I think actually I was invited to photograph at the Museum of Contemporary Art for some kind of installation. I remember going to some kind of party at the Pump Room, which was a famous restaurant in Chicago. I think it still is, actually. Some parties that I was invited to. There were other photographers doing it at the time. Friedlander was doing it, Winogrand was doing it, Arbus was doing it. You know, it wasn't so unusual. It's a vignette that was caused by, I had a Rolleiflex single lens reflex camera, which I was just talking to Isik about it. It's called an SL66. It had a bellows on it. It also, you could drop the front for the Scheinflug principle to get depth of field. You could raise it, that was another story. But I had a wide-angle lens, but I had the wrong lens shade on it. I had the normal lens shade, and I liked it. It was an accident. So I used it because it reflected the portholes, it reflected to the voyeurism, it sort of sucked the person in, TV screen, all the things that it reflected, you know, that were in the culture.
I was curious about this when, you know, when we talked about color a little bit, that Ernst Haas was the one you went to, and I'm curious about that.
Well, when we were teaching at Columbia College, this is mid-70s, we started a program called the Contemporary Photography Lecture Series, which was widely celebrated in Chicago and incredibly well attended. You know, sometimes you get 250, 500 people, and we brought in famous photographers. How many know who Ernst Haas was? Everybody? Okay. He's kind of a forgotten figure. He was president of Magnum. He did the first color for Life magazine. He was really a great photographer. A little precious and a little precious, I would just say, and sometimes pictorial. But he did pictures like this. And he did a lot of wonderful pictures in New York and everywhere he went. And we had him for a lecture. And there was a time when artists, photographers of art weren't doing much color, though we were introduced to it by a guy named Chuck Swedlin, who you probably don't know. And this is mid-70s, early 70s. And these are two Ernst Haas pictures, which no one puts him in the legacy of color photography, color street, the social documentary photography. You know, we have Shore and Eggleston, but you know, how do you forget this guy? You know, and I remember being very moved by it at the time. And perhaps it was one of the triggers that led me to color. There were other people, a guy named Wayne Source in Chicago, we knew. There were lots of people. Fred Herzog, does anybody know who that was?
Vancouver.
Huh?
Vancouver.
Vancouver, there was
Luigi Gary.
Vivian Mayer did it.
Saul Leiter.
Helen Levitt did color. I mean, lots of people were doing color. Now, one of the problems was, and I remember Haas was showing transparencies on the projector, you know. And of course, the projectors always broke. And, you know, he wasn't making prints. He wasn't showing prints. He was showing transparency, because that's what freelance, editorial, independent, real-world witness, what I call real-world witness photographers did. And actually, the idea of showing something, you know, in the art world or in the gallery world that was a transparency, or, you know, using it the way we now would use video, taboo, you know, taboo. And only did that break, I think, really when The Balance of Sexual Dependency came out, which was a slideshow that organized by Marvin Heiferman, our colleague at SVA, and where that was really the show. It was not accepted in the canon, you know, particularly transparency. And I've forgotten about that, but Most of you probably know that, well, maybe 5 years ago, Drew Sawyer at the Brooklyn Museum actually did a wonderful exhibition of those same pictures. And so that history is all fucked up as far as I'm concerned. And I started doing color. This is a project called Lunchtime. It took place late 70s. People on the street. I was teaching and running a program at Columbia College. I'd go out on the street, lunchtime, and photograph people cars. I was very interested in all the kinds of ways people presented themselves in public. I had read a wonderful book by Irving Goffman called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. He's one of the great sociologists of the 20th century. A very readable book, not a pedantic academic book, but full of sardonic issues and even jokes about the nature that people present themselves as an actor. They present the mask that they think people want to see. They're always in performance. People are not unconscious of how they look, how they are, and what they're doing, particularly in public, but also in all engagements of language and discourse. There were people in my world, on the streets of Chicago. This one is actually Blackpool, England, a place I went with Aaron Siskin, actually. And he was photographing some rocks, I think, and I was photographing people. People in public presenting themselves as they are, or as they, not as they are, as they want to be seen. Let's put it that way.
I want to just jump in with a question that we were talking about, which is the experience versus the photograph, and which is more important, getting out there and making the picture, or getting back and looking at the picture and having that evidence of the experience?
Well, it's a tough question. I mean, both are interconnected, but look, being a photographer, being able to move into the world and take a picture because you're just curious about what it looks like and what people look like is a great privilege. Talking to this woman, I don't exactly remember what she said, but I had dialogue with these people saying, well, what do you do? Where do you live? Blah, 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 blah. And vice versa. Why are you doing it? I said, because I'm interested in what people look like. And she said, yeah, I like it. People were a little more open. It was more accessible, I think, in the 70s and even into the 80s. So I think the privilege is the experience, but then having some artifact of that experience that says, hey, this isn't exactly what I remember, but it is a memory, and it is, I think, a record of some historical value somewhere in history. And most people saw this book came out finally in, I don't know, 2013 or 14. I got all these calls from people about the sunglasses, articles about sunglasses, people in sunglasses and glasses, because the styles are different. You know exactly when this took place. And, several fashion magazines ran pictures of some of the people in sunglasses. This tells you how people looked in that period. So if it's not, whatever else it is, it's a record of a time and a place. Almost all of these pictures, I don't think there's a second shot. I would ask them, may I take your picture? And they would say yes, and that's the moment I usually hit the button. Because that's before they posed, before they got self-conscious. I always ask these people, if I could take their picture. If you wait, then they start posing, then they start to get more self-conscious. So it feels more natural to me this way, yeah.
I think, though, I just want to jump in on that. I've always thought Charlie's always been more assertive than I am, but I also like to, when I see someone that I find interesting, or for whatever reason, what I've found is that if someone's willing to stop and give you 10 seconds, they're probably willing to stop and give you a minute or something. So I try and take a breath and allow them to kind of settle in. So, you know, with my students, I'm like, don't rush. If they're willing to stop, they're probably willing to, you know, people want to be acknowledged. They want to be noticed. That's
really important. People love to be acknowledged. I think if you properly approach it, everybody wants to be seen. That's part of the Irving Goffman idea. I put on a mask here. I want you to recognize that mask. I want you to recognize I put this beautiful purple scarf on or these beautiful glasses. And I think if you approach it with that, I think that's something I completely forgot that was part of my instinct, you know, that as a counterpoint to what I was doing, at the same time I started photographing in uptown Chicago. If you know Chicago, that was up 52, 5300 North. It's all gentrified now, but in those days it was the Bowery, the equivalent of the Bowery. Ainsley, and there was a stop there. And there were shelters there, and if anybody saw Hassel Wexler's Medium Cool, did anybody see that, know that from Illinois? There, a lot of it was filmed up there. And I was photographing the indigent street. We didn't call them homeless, they were mostly down and out, hard luck. What I now call Skid Row, or what that term refers to. And I thought I should do that because I had spent so much time on the fancy part of Chicago streets, Michigan Avenue, that I ought to look at something different. And I did this project in Chicago, and then I moved to New York, and since I lived in the Village, I did a lot of work on the Bowery. This one's on the Bowery, I think that one's in New York. I mean in Chicago. And I tried to give dignity and some kind of intimacy with these people who were ordinarily ignored, though they were a community, a kind of community that doesn't exist anymore, that people like Nelson Algren wrote about, Studs Terkel wrote about them, Mitchell wrote about them, all kinds of writers wrote about them, and so I call it Skid Row, and it happens that that book is presently being printed now and will be out this fall. Called Skid Row, with an essay about Tom Hune, if anybody knows Tom. So,
I want to just jump in here. I mean, you know, especially with your work that you've made since I've known you, it's been very United States, American culture centered, and you know, I know you've done work all over the world, and this is a Dolce, what is it called, Dolce Vita?
Dolce Via.
Via, Dolce Vita.
Pun on Dolce Vita.
So I'm curious, you know, what was different in the experience of photographing outside of your own culture, being an outsider and looking in a different way?
Well, I guess all of us have that experience. I think it's very important to look outside of your own culture and to go look and explore and be curious about others. And I don't like this idea that I can't go there because I'm not one of them. I think it's really prohibitive and keeps us from engaging other people and finding out more about them. I think when you go to a place like Italy, which I had been to as a younger person a couple of times, I guess, but we went another road trip through Italy. I think this might have been at that time, I'm not sure with that trip. You're looking at something fresh. You don't really know it. You're finding out about it, and you're investigating it, and you're seeing its beauty and foibles and everything else kind of fresh. And every time I just came back from Miami 2 nights ago, and I came back to New York, and I thought how glorious it is. I just saw it again, you know, because in Miami you're in a car all the time, you know, it's all different. There are no places where people really gather or really worked quite the same. And that's why you go away and you come back. And I think that's what the road trip is about. That's what we all need to do, to go into other. I'm very tired of people photographing the dust under their grandmother's bed. That's my way of putting it. I'm really tired of it. Get the hell out there in the real world and go look at something, explore it, and be curious. make some mistakes, maybe get slapped across the face, you know, but look at some other people other than your own, you know. Learn about them.
Speaking of which.
This picture comes up because somewhere in that period I met Klein. I did a show of his, the first real big show he had in New York, I think in '79, William Klein. I think he was a giant in every way. Again, another photographer in this country was greatly ignored, particularly from the MoMA institution, which really kind of pushed back about anybody who got intimate with the camera, really got in there and tried to pull the people into their experience and vice versa. Klein was not only a great photographer, a great designer, and I think one of the greatest documentary filmmakers in the 20th century. He just died this fall. I assume many of you saw the show at ICP. The show we did was pretty much all those pictures, and like Gallery, MoMA people basically ignored it because it wasn't omnipotent. This is another Italy picture from Naples, a commission I had with Luigi Ghiri. Another great color photographer, was working in the period at the same time Eggleston began working, more humorous, a little more postmodern, I would say. And we became good friends, and I traveled with him several times in Italy as well. And this is a Naples landscape. And sort of, you know, I always went back to landscape. I mean, how do you avoid the landscape, you know, when you're dealing with people in an environment? So, you know, that's why I hate that word, street photography. What the fuck is street photography? Does that mean I can't shoot a watermelon on the street? Or I can't shoot a still life? Or, you know, it's a bad term. All those terms are bad, by the way. Conceptual photography, all good art is conceptual. They're bad terms. We have to use them sometimes to categorize things, but they're not great things to use. We need better words, more in-depth ideas. This work is part of another book that's for sale here if you want to buy it, called In the Still Life. It came out in 2004, I think. I was pretty busy throughout the 90s organizing SVA and all the stuff that some of you know about. But I also in the late 80s, early 90s, traveled a lot doing editorial work and corporate work. I wouldn't call it commercial. And I did fortunately get around the world quite a bit. Never made any money doing it because it didn't pay well ultimately, but you had a lot of fun. And on my off time, I would shoot, we always shot transparencies. These are pictures that I would throw in a box that I made on my own time. And one day I looked at them and said, these are really good. These are humorous. These are me relaxed. These are me, you know, not having to prove anything, not having to do a project. And so, and I use the term in the still life because I think all still photographs are in the still life. Everything is objectified. Everything becomes an object. Everything is dead or alive and stopped in time. And, you know, as Klein once said, you know, if you have 100 or so pictures, you know, that's at 125th of a second, that's about a minute in time, you know, something like 2 minutes maybe, you know. And that's sort of what it's about.
I want to just jump in. Something I've been talking about a lot with students and friends is the lack of humor in photography right now, in terms of particularly fine art photography. And you know, humor is something that's a part of a lot of your work. It's always in the service of a bigger message. But why do you think people are so scared of humor?
Because they're silly.
Because they're silly?
I don't know. I mean, if it doesn't have some strum and drang and isn't obscure and vague and existential, but actually good humor is all of those things turns it on its head. And the humor always has an edge to it, ultimately. Yeah, it's just dirt there. Yeah. Someone, when we went to make this book, somebody wanted the designer, or somebody wanted to take it out, you know. You could do it in those days. Yeah. I said, no, leave it there. You know, it belongs there. Aaron Siskin said that to us. He said, there's a famous picture of his with a car in front of one of the facade windows. And I think you asked him was, why did you leave the car there? Because it was there, you know. And that's what the photograph is. It wasn't deep, you know, Freudian analysis of it. We did have a teacher who did do that. But also, he would say, it's a beauty, you know. And if you got the beauty, that's it. Then you thought, and then his cigarette ash would fall on it. You know, in a way, life is a big joke, you know, and if you're lacking in humor, you're going to have a tough time getting through, I think. You have to laugh at yourself, and you have to see that being human is in some ways being silly, doing dumb things, putting things in the wrong place, things juxtaposed. I mean, that's part of the dynamic of the urban environment. I mean, everything's mixed up. Everything's layered on it. It's also part of the postmodern thinking, you know, that we're you know, anything can mix. I mean, look at us, you know. So this is a project called New York on the Edge, which was a commission by the New York City Parks Department to document I did it with Jerry Gordon, who's deceased, partner. You came along about that time. We used medium format and a panorama camera called a Fuji 6x12. 6 by, yeah. And we documented pretty much the entire New York waterfront before anything was very much transitioned. And Jonathan carried the tripod. And we didn't have to drive. So did you go up in the helicopter that time? You didn't do that? And it was a mess. And part of it still is, but it's amazing what's happened since. And what the premise was that it is the best recreational place in New York. And even if it was in pretty bad shape, and we have pictures that show people like Long Island City was just a wreck. There was nothing there, but people still went to the beach there. This is with Brooklyn Heights. This was not a wreck. This was one of the better viewpoints, looking out over to Manhattan and the Twin Towers. And this is a large project that's never really been published, but I think the City of New York Museum has it, and it was shown a number of places in New York, and I think the Parks Department has a complete collection. And I think ICP has some of these too. This is a book of pictures that was taken everywhere and anywhere, mostly in the late 90s and early 2000s, called tardiddle. It's a British term. Anybody know what it means? No. Tardiddle is a little kind of white lie kind of vision. That word I use, I just like the way it sounded, but also that all photographs are a little white lie. You know, they all tell stories, and they're not exactly true. They're out of context, and again, there's always a little humor in the white lie. This was Russia, 2002, I think. We did a show called Here's New York. That was about 9/11, and we traveled to Russia. That was my first time there. And again, it's humorous, the wedding, the horse and the horse, and the edges and the edges, and blah, 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 blah. I just like it. Then, I mean, we're missing a number of other projects. This is a project that Matt and I connected on because he was interested in the Civil War, and I was. I documented all the places and places where U.S. Grant fought, lived, touched upon, and I became very interested in Grant, having read a biography about him, several, I probably read 10 now. Is the great unsung hero of American life. Grant was certainly the greatest general we ever had, and perhaps one of the greatest in all of history. He was been maligned in the lost-caused era by the Confederate historians who wrote after the war and the rise and sort of reparations of the Confederacy and the kind of, you know, it was just a kind of war. We were kind people. And Grant was a brilliant man, a humble man who rose up. He had gone to West Point. He wasn't particularly interested in the military, but when the war broke out, he knew he had to do something, and he rose very, very quickly up the ranks. He was a pauper. He had failed at everything else prior to the war, and even had to sell his gold watch and stuff like that. And we would not have won the Civil War. The North would not have won without him, quite clearly. And on his deathbed, after he was president, which was also, you know, riddled with the idea that there was lots of scandal. Actually, there wasn't very much. And he had a brilliant vision for Reconstruction that got destroyed by terrible politicians. But he wrote his memoirs called Memoirs. And it's considered by many, many people, including people like Gertrude Stein and Hemingway and Matthew Arnold, as being the greatest piece of nonfiction literature of the 19th century. He dictated it on his deathbed, dying of throat cancer. He smoked a lot of cigars. And this is a book called No Perfect Heroes, Photographing Grant. It is available for free online as an online iBook with text, pictures. I think there are about almost 80 pictures in it, and readings from the memoirs by Edo Ballerini. Does anybody know who he is? He's considered the voice of God. He's the reader of audiobooks. He's the most celebrated audiobook reader. He was the son of a friend and did it for nothing. So it's free. You can go to my website. You'll get the link. And I give it away in honor every year for Grant's birthday, which was April 27th. So anyway. And that's followed. This is the most really, well, not the most recent, actually. This is called Tickety-Boo. And these are pictures I took with a cell phone. I have a new camera now. It's got a phone and internet in it. It's 14. It's not an inexpensive thing. It's quite amazing. All these pictures were taken from about 2013, 14 to 2020, something like that. And they're paired together in a narrative, and it's for sale too if you would like to buy a copy. And they're from all over, anywhere and anywhere. I've come to the conclusion I don't need to come up with a project. I'll find the project if I do enough wandering and looking, and it'll come together. And that's really my modus operandi.
I want to just, again, as someone who's taught for a long time, I think, and I was not someone who really spent a lot of time on Instagram before I started PhotoPhlo. But it's astonishing to me how many people I work with for their first time, and they say, oh, this is my project on this is my project on this is this project, this is that project. And what I'm finding, and this is just something I think about, is that a lot of, you know, sort of less experienced photographers are writing a one-sentence thesis or concept and then going out and illustrating it and not giving themselves the freedom to make pictures in the way that Charlie has done for so long, and letting the ideas emerge out of making work. And I think Charlie's a great example of working in that way. And I think a lot of you know, younger, less experienced photographers should let go of the concept for a little bit and just go out and make pictures.
The digital age came along, and people weren't as interested in it as this come back. But I discourage people from shooting analog. And the reason is, please forgive me, it's too damn expensive. What does a roll of film cost? What's it cost?
Average.
Huh?
$15.
But you give us a discount, right? So you got to get it processed, because they don't know how to process it. I go up, we have a darkroom at SVA still. They're going like this, you know. I mean, they don't know how to use the tank or anything, you know. And then, so they send it out. So that's another $15. That's $30 a roll. In our day, we would shoot 5 to 10 rolls of film a day. And you can do it with the digital world. You got to learn to edit. You still got to learn all the compositional elements. You got to learn to print properly digitally, which isn't easy. But part of the reason I'm saying this to answer that question is students don't go out and shoot enough. They just want to make, you know, come back with 10 pictures in a week. You know, it's not enough. You got to make a lot of trash. You got to experiment. You got to be there when it's happening. And the digital world allows you to do it, but you know, and the analog doesn't. But they, even with the digital world, maybe their students are too pressed. I don't know, for time. Maybe their workload is too heavy. They got to earn a living. All right, all these things. But if you don't go out and you're not thinking about shooting all the time, you can't get there. And frankly, we had the luxury of, in my generation, of doing it. It was, you know, we taught. That's why we became teachers, because we knew that's the way to make a living. It would give us some free time to go on road trips. You know, now there's not many teaching jobs. It's a problem. I don't have the answer, but I do know that if you're not out there looking, you're not out there wandering, you're not out there engaging the real world, even if you ultimately want to come back to make things in the studio or make things in a different way, you need that experience. And it's the reason you actually do come to study in the visual arts. You want to learn how to think visually. You want to learn how to be a visual person in a world that is dominated by visual media. And that's where the issue of visual learning, visual understanding comes in, or what they used to call visual literacy, which I think is not a good term, but we need to be teaching those things. We need to be learning those things at the very primary level. Particularly in the day of the rise of AI. We need to know what's real and not real. We need to note it. And we need to learn from AI, but we need to learn from it to experience the real world in new ways. So I've been digital since '98. And the program started at SVA in '88 as the first digital program. Though we weren't entirely digital because of the equipment and things, and we still had to buy stuff from him. But you know.
I remember my first week of school. I had been shooting 35mm film, and it was, I think, orientation. And I said, you know, where are the dark rooms? And Charlie said, what do you need a dark room for? And I said, well, I shoot 35mm. And he just looked at me and rolled his eyes and walked away. And you know, 6 months later, I'm shooting digitally, and I'm learning from Katrine Eisman, who is, you know, one of the best in the world. And you know, for me, it was great.
This is really the last project which took place over COVID. Wandering again, I would look and, you know, there were so many vacant spaces, and I'd come out in the evening and working, and I'd see something, and this idea of, well, Mark Twain looked at the Roman Forum when he did Travels Abroad, and he said, one day in America we shall have ruins as great as these. And that's sort of what this is about, my personal experience of COVID.
Well, I want to just get to this picture because it brings you full circle.
Ever since I began, from the first picture you saw, that little house. I've been photographing little houses all my career. I have hundreds of them, both analog and digital. And this is one in Kentucky, which I think is very timely about the gun violence that is wreaking havoc in this country. I think it's a good question. It's not that you don't go out with it. I mean, you discover something through your work, and I think the more experience you get, you realize you have more than one project going. And then you realize, well, this is intriguing. Like, let's just use this last one, the storefronts. I made a few, I mean, I have hundreds of them, you know. And I thought, you know, this is something really meaningful for me. This is New York at this moment in history. And it's a metaphor for loneliness, the vacancy from our remove from commerce and all those things, the end of a bank, you know. And then you realize, you know, this is worth pursuing, and you pursue it more, and you keep pursuing it. And then all of a sudden one day I did enough of these. You know, there's nothing more I can say about it. And sometimes that comes quicker, and sometimes you don't know when to stop, and you should have stopped. And then you have a lot, and then you sit down with, where's Jan? Where'd she go?
She's right there.
With her and, you know, my assistant, and we start editing, and we look, and we put them up on the wall, and we say, well, there's a lot of good with that one doesn't fit, and you spend another year editing it, and maybe you come up with something. And I decided this business of looking for publishers is so complicated that I would just publish it myself as a zine, and I found this thing called Newspaper Club in England, and it was very reasonable. We did 250 of these, and it got a lot of attention. Being at Gagosian Gallery, selling lots of pictures, and, who knows? I mean, what is I think Benjamin Franklin, success is a bitch goddess. Benjamin Franklin said that. He did.
What does it mean?
Well, it means if you're always worrying about it, it's going to tangle you up in knots.
Yeah.
And, you know, sure, you know, I'd like to sell more pictures. I'd like to have 10 million shows and have people climb all over me to do this book or that book. But my success is I did it. You know, I mean, being a photographer, being an artist, having the position I have, being healthy, and I've made a lot of pictures and I've gotten a lot of feedback on it. And history will tell us what is art. There's a lot of art out there that's very successful that is pretty shitty, in my opinion, and lots that's unsung, as I've mentioned today. And lots that deserves all the accolades that it's gotten. And who knows how it happens, you know? I mean, museums are and curators and galleries often, with some exceptions, to deal with those things that are outside of the mainstream, or to look for new. And, you know, if you look at the museums, they all will do another Avedon show, or another blah, 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 you know? Do we really need it? No, but they need it to make the money. So, you know, you have to understand that this aspiration for the art world is tainted by the fact that it is a commodity, and you know, and it's okay to be a part of that, to make money from it, and to make hope that it will become a commodity of interest to people. But if that's the reason you're doing it, just for that, you're going to have a lot of disappointment, which I've had too.
Well, I'm going to just tell a little story as another route to that answer, which was that I forgot who it was, but I was in Charlie's office a few years after graduating. I forget who was in there. We were talking. Charlie was doing whatever, reading, you know, on the computer, and this other person and I were talking, and we were whining and moaning about how hard it is to be an artist, and teaching and all of these things, and he's just over there. He didn't say anything, and then he gets up and he walks over. He's like, I don't want to hear any more of this. He said, you get to go on road trips, you get breaks from school, you get to go make pictures, you get to go out in the world, and then he walked out and just left us there. We're both like, okay.
I still feel that way, you know. Yeah. I hear people, oh, well, you know, you can make this picture anything you want. You got a license. I'm an artist. I'm a photographer. You know, it's a privilege. You get to, you know, look at it any way you want, you know.
We're lucky.
Just, you know, it's pretty lucky. Now, it's full of pitfalls. I'm not trying to be a Pollyanna about it. It's very tough because you got to make a living, and maybe you need to drive a cab. You know? I don't know. It's more probably, there's so many photographers in the world today. Everybody's a photographer.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of good ones out there, a lot of artists. There are lots of wonderful artists out there. And so why one person's famous and another's not, or there's no rationale to it. This also sounds a little, you all know this. Keep at it long enough and something happens, or at least you finally say, you know, I got something out of it.
Yeah.
You know, meantime, you got to pay the bill. It's very hard to live in New York. It's very hard to be an artist in many ways. But I don't think artists are entitled to something without the hard work, practice, and the failures and the issues that other people are. And there's some attitude about that. I'm an artist. I deserve this. Well, I don't know about that. I
wrote down a few things that I thought of that I learned from Charlie, and I just want to read those and then we'll be done, which is be engaged, be fearless, have purpose, fight for the weak, question power, make pictures from the outside in, bend your knees, bring a stepladder on road trips, and always have your camera with you. So.
Matt, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
For
thank
hosting
you.
this, for putting together, putting the question.
And thank you to Launch Photo Books.
Thank you.
Yeah. Buy books. Go buy books.